My name is Robert Duback, and I'm working as Marine Spatial Planning Coordinator at the County Administrative Board of Kalmar in Sweden. For those of you who are not familiar with the Swedish circumstances when it comes to the authorities, the County Administrative Board is a regional governmental authority which have a wide field of different tasks. When it comes to planning, to take an example, the county administrative boards are representing the government in the dialogue when the municipalities are making their detailed and comprehensive plans. I wish you very welcome to this webinar, where I will try to introduce you to some of the issues regarding monitoring and evaluation in marine or maritime spatial planning. I think you have figured out already that it's difficult to find definitions and make comparisons depending on how each country have implemented the EU Marine Spatial Planning Directive. Sweden, as an example, are making marine spatial plans, but the directive is mentioning maritime spatial plans. In some cases, the differences may be irrelevant or the meaning exactly the same. In some situations, it may differ significantly. Let's start with some words about the Swedish Marine Spatial Planning according to the EU Marine Spatial Planning Directive. There are 3 marine spatial plan areas in Sweden, starting in the west with the Western Sea. Then we have the Baltic proper, and in the north, in the Baltic Sea, we have the Botnian Bay. In Sweden, there are 21 county administrative boards totally. 14 of them are situated at the sea. 3 of them, including Kalmar, are coordinating other county administrative boards within the area of that specific marine spatial plan. The County of Kalmar are coordinating 7 county administrative boards within the area of the Baltic Sea Marine Spatial Plan. In the County of Kalmar, we have 12 municipalities. 7 of them are situated at the Baltic Sea. As you probably know, the Swedish municipalities have the right to plan large areas in the sea, as their comprehensive plans may stretch as far as 12 nautical miles, or as far to the EEZ. As the marine spatial plans are consisting only of governmental interests and are decided by the Swedish government, they will interact with the comprehensive plans of the municipalities in the territorial sea. On the picture you can see the Castle of Kalmar, which is situated very close to the sea, and the view of the Baltic Sea towards the south. Before we start to speak about monitoring and evaluation, I would like to show you a last slide about the conditions affecting Swedish marine spatial planning according to the EU MSP directive. This is to illustrate why you always must take the national implementation into account when discussing issues in marine spatial planning. This is the marine spatial plan, the Baltic proper. Let's start with the orange arrows. As you can see, there is a zone close to land which are not a part of the planning area. This is due to the implementation of the MSP directive in Sweden. Now you can focus on the yellow arrows, the territorial sea. It's covered by both the municipalities' comprehensive plans and will also be covered by the Swedish governmental marine spatial plan. Hence, there will be 2 guiding plans in the same specific geographical area. During this webinar, I will do my best to share my experiences, especially from a Swedish perspective. I will try to raise your interest regarding the important questions of monitoring and evaluation. But during these 40 minutes, there is no chance to completely cover the field of monitoring and evaluations, including their definitions, methods, etc. I suggest that we during this webinar will stay with the EU Directive 2014/89 and some kind of generic marine spatial planning process, because most of us can relate to the EU directive. Some of you may already have realized that the planning process of the EU directive are complex due to different national legislations and circumstances. This is also true when it comes to monitoring and evaluation. You have to remember that this is the first time ever that marine spatial plans according to the EU directive with a more holistic approach than before have been produced. So it's still a learning process for most of us working with the plans. Keep in mind that the plans shall be renewed at least every 10th year. But the questions regarding monitoring needs to be considered during the whole process. Do not start discussing monitoring and evaluation when you have the finished marine spatial plan in front of you. Planning of the sea didn't start because of the EU directive. There is and have always been a practical need to organize activities connected to the sea. Many sectors are already dealing with issues of how to use the sea from a spatial point of view. They have done this for many years, usually from a sector's perspective. This makes the need for more holistic marine spatial planning, as in the EU directive, obvious. Planning usually organizes the activities when it comes to infrastructure, but the environmental perspective is very strong in the EU Marine Spatial Planning Directive. When it comes to energy production, most countries have, due to political decisions, plans for abandoning fossil fuels. The need for renewable energy is rising, so we have to find new areas in the sea and on land. The great advantage with the sea is more stable and favorable wind conditions. Establishing wind farms at sea makes other sectors interested in the spatial use of the sea. The shipping sector will start wondering if there will be safety distances to the shipping lanes. The defense might start to ask questions if they can carry on flying in specific areas or continue with naval exercises. And the municipalities will start to ask if wind farms will be visible from the coastline. Of course, there is also an environmental perspective, especially in the Baltic Sea. Some are connected to the eutrophication sources on land, but there is a need to take the activities that are in the sea into account when trying to lessen the burden on the ecosystems. As you probably know, the Baltic Sea is suffering from low oxygen conditions at the sea bottoms, algal blooms in the summer, and decreasing fish stocks. So there is a need to consider where to build those sea-based offshore wind farms, to think twice if we should place a cable here or there, and to update our knowledge when it comes to how to use. High sound levels in the sea affect several species. Will we be able to change the way we are using the sea? So, considering the evaluation and monitoring, when and where should we perform the evaluation and monitoring? Let us make a very rough division of how we can approach the question about monitoring and evaluation. Of course, there are numerous ways to elaborate with the definitions of monitoring and evaluation, depending on the context. But anyway, let's make a very rough division to approach the important questions. You most probably will consider the process first, because you might know the date when you can start to work with a marine spatial plan, and you know when it has to be finished. In between, you will have to decide when you have to contact different stakeholders and what message you are going to bring. And of course, you will bring a message back from the stakeholders. But of course, evaluating a process might as well include preparing and evaluating individual meetings with specific sectors, like the shipping sector, as well as how to communicate the marine spatial planning process during a 4-year period. You may also consider the diversity of objectives that the plan will fulfill when it comes to how to use the sea bottom, and the space below the sea bottom, the water column, and the air in the most appropriate way. Planning are always a question of how an area can be used, by who and when. If you're lucky, there might be political initiatives early in the process, specific legislations, policies regarding different sectors, at different geographical levels. Make yourself familiar with those documents and make your own plan for how the different sectors that are active in the specific area of the sea that you're going to plan. Try to establish an overview, which itself can be communicated. This overview will be a valuable tool when the plan is being drawn to explain how, who, when, etc. In the end, you don't want to end up in a situation receiving most of the important critical political directives from your politicians when the process is finished and the plan has already been written and acknowledged by all the stakeholders, except the politicians. The plan itself consists of a map and written instructions how to interpret the plan. The nature of the plan itself, whether it is a steering plan or a guiding plan, will affect the evaluation and monitoring. Here, the implementation in each specific country are crucial. Also, the surrounding ecosystem or different tools like policies, legislations, national economical subsidies, etc. might have to be considered. Even if you decide that you are only monitoring the effects of the plan, there may be good reasons to get yourself an overview of the complete picture. These three elements, the plan, the objectives, and the process, are crucial to keep in mind from the beginning until the end of your work when the plan is finished. So you might think that you may find some support in the EU Marine Spatial Plan Directive. So let's take a closer look at the text in the directive. Starting with objectives, you will find out that as a directive, it is written so that it's dealing with the questions in an overview perspective. The objectives are the ecological, economical, and social objectives that should be reached by using an ecosystems approach. You will find some of the information in Article 3 or Article 5. When you study the directive, there are not so many detailed descriptions of how the objectives should be further interpreted. If some of you have the possibility to make comparisons with the Water Frame Directive, which also contains areas in the sea within 1 nautical mile from the baseline, you will find that there are huge differences when it comes to the level of details in many aspects. Sometimes you may probably think that parts of the text in the MSP directive have not even been written with a helicopter perspective in mind, rather the satellite perspective. And in many cases, it is your duty as a planner to bring the perspective down to the ground or sea level to be able to communicate with the stakeholders. So let's take a closer look at what you may find more specific regarding the evaluation and monitoring of these objectives in the directive. Now, focus on the yellow parts. Here you can see from introduction of the directive, the point number 18 to the left in the picture, that the directive states that revision and updating, as well as monitoring of the implementation process, are considered a part of the full MSP cycle. In Articles 14 to the right, it is stated that a report should be made every 4th year to outline the progress of implementing the directive. The report will be sent to the EU Commission, which will report to the Parliament and the Council. So, how should you, as the responsible planner, as the planner in charge, be able to show how you have interpreted the objectives and how you are evaluating and monitoring them so that the plan delivers what politicians, sector representatives, policies, the public, and future generations are expecting from you, without monitoring and evaluation? In this situation, both the objectives and the monitoring evaluation of the MSP directive must be defined and perhaps adjusted as they are dependent and interlinked with each other. In this situation, both the objectives and the monitoring evaluation of the MSP directive must be defined and perhaps adjusted as they are dependent on each other. You will soon find out that many scientific papers write about models and theories about how to monitor and evaluate the process, the objectives, the plan, but few methods have been tried in a real MSP process. My advice is that you should not set any objectives or plan for anything that you, in some way, will be unable to evaluate or monitor. This is a very simplified model of the interaction between some aspects in marine spatial planning. In this picture, we are starting with the objectives of the EU MSP directive. Parallelly, you are starting a process to identify relevant stakeholders and making a time schedule. You have to deal with our objectives and how to monitor and evaluate them from the Marine Spatial Planning Directive's point of view. In the end, you simply just have to write the draft plan to confirm what have been communicated during the process about the objectives and how to monitor and evaluate them and the use of the plan. You might ask yourself, why should we plan and how should we plan? Both planning, evaluation and monitoring could be made according to different philosophies. If you're studying a basic course in planning, you will most likely get in touch with different philosophies, paradigms, policies, and methods for planning. Of course, they have changed over the years. Usually, examples to illustrate the philosophies are taken from land-based planning. Often are they focusing on urban development. The most common philosophies that are mentioned when talking about marine spatial planning is the conformance-based or the performance-based planning philosophies. In short, conformance-based are focused on how well the expected results from the plan will be reached. the performance-based or focusing more on how other policies, plans, etc. are being influenced by, in this case, the Marine Spatial Plan. Will look slightly different ways depending on the planning philosophy used. Perhaps is the easiest way to think of planning, evaluation and monitoring, perhaps that they should facilitate a better and a learning process, increasing the stakeholder engagement and setting realistic and attainable goals that can be confirmed by evaluation, and that the plans are relevant and up to date for the users. You might ask yourself why you need evaluation and monitoring. There are many reasons to perform an evaluation and monitor different moments when producing Marine Spatial Plan. It can be summed up with the following points. We have the credibility. As a planner, you will of course ensure that the process worked well from the stakeholders' point of view. Otherwise, the plan and the next process to review the plan will probably become a hard time. The will to impose the plan among the stakeholders will most probably be insignificant. And of course, the public sector must show that we are producing value for the money. The second point, limited space. This means that some sector may have to give up some of their spatial claims in the sea or share an area with some other sector. You will have to show that the changes and the solutions suggested in the plan are really working. Ecosystem services. I don't think this point needs to be motivated in a Baltic Sea perspective. Follow up the changes that are suggested in the plan. Point 4. Follow the changes suggested in the plan. Are the changes suggested that were discussed during the process and later expressed in the plan? Do they really work? Does the plan deliver the expected outcome? Point 5. Last but not least, I believe we need hope. Hope to feel that we can deliver renewable energy, safe shipping, reshape the ecosystems and keep our Baltic Sea in a good state for future generations. And doing all this at the same time. When trying to describe the process to the stakeholders, you may end up with a picture like this, taken from the early Swedish process. If you're looking at the left, you can see that in 2012 the preparation in Sweden started, and it ends in 2021 with the decision by the government. Here the stakeholders can get an overview and see all the moments and get a rough indication when to be prepared to participate in the MSP process. You can use a backcasting technique to set out important deadlines, etc. to create this kind of process picture. This overview is a first step to get familiar with the stakeholders and their different objectives. The stakeholders need to see that there is a structure for the communication and the process so that they can prepare themselves for their own processes. This is a very important tool for communicating the process. When you have made a rough picture of how the process will look like, then you will also be able to evaluate the process using different indicators, perhaps to see whether some sector or geographic area, etc. are underrepresented during the participation process. To the left, you can see a circle that shows how different groups of Swedish stakeholders have participated during the process. They are divided into authorities, municipalities, regions, sector organizations, political parties, the public, regional authorities, and enterprises. To the right, you can see how many of the Swedish municipalities that participated during the participation process. Here is a picture showing some different Swedish stakeholders in the Stockholm area and how they were categorized into different groups during the early stages of the process. Of course, each stakeholder has their own objectives, perhaps their own evaluation and monitoring, and their own spatial claims in the sea. This is why it is necessary to prepare for a right communication process. Even if it's early in the Marine Spatial Plan process, it will be valuable for you and the stakeholders during the meetings to see whether all relevant stakeholders have been identified and listed in a correct manner. Make your own map or picture that you can show to check whether you have understood the complete picture. Are you aware of the situation for those who are going to be involved in the maritime spatial planning? This will be the proof. There are some questions that you will need to answer, as the questions all stakeholders will ask you during the participation process most probably will be: when will we as stakeholders participate in the process? In which way can our opinion affect the plan? What will the plan look like in the end? Have our opinions been expressed in the plan? As you will realize, some sectors have much stronger legislation in their backs, have gained more political influence over the years, and are more well organized than others. Others are up and coming and are claiming space for their activities. When it comes to nature protection, there might be an issue trying to make exclusive areas dedicated for nature protection. But how are you going to treat the different stakeholders in the context of the EU Marine Spatial Planning Directive? How will the energy sector's expectations, considering the 93 terawatt-hours sea-based wind farms until 2050, work with all the other stakeholders? Sometimes these unequal power relationships does not reflect the situation of today, but rather the historical situation. To solve the issues, political decisions at a high level are needed to solve the spatial claims. This is what is happening in Sweden at the moment when it comes to sea-based offshore wind power and other sectors. As you probably will find out when you have studied the sectors and their power relationships, all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. When you have made yourself a brief overview of the process and you have identified the stakeholders, you may have to start take a closer look at their objectives. Here we can see some of the Swedish national authorities and a short message about the overall goals of their organizations. We can see that the Swedish armed forces have a vision which includes a stronger defense and the ability to respond to every threat, facing every challenge. On the other hand, we have the Swedish Energy Agency, which wants to be a leader in the society's transition to a sustainable energy system, which of course includes sea-based energy. And we have the Swedish Maritime Administration, who wants to promote favorable conditions for the maritime sector in Sweden and for Swedish shipping. And of course, we have the Swedish Agency for Marine and Water Management, who are actually making the plan proposals for the Swedish Marine Spatial Plans that are going to be presented for the government. They work for flourishing seas, lakes and streams for the benefit and enjoyment of all. Bear in mind that you're in the process of bringing with you new perspectives that you may have to introduce in a proper way. You need to come on speaking terms with the stakeholders. Their own existing monitoring and evaluation might perhaps be of interest in particular parts. How are the Swedish Maritime Administration measuring their ecological, economical and social objectives? Remember the Article 3 from the EU Directive. Are there any performance indicators that might be used to track the EU Marine Spatial Planning Directive objectives regarding the ecological, economic and social objectives? The different sectors may have a slightly different opinion about the ecosystem approach than the EU Directive. Most likely, the concept of ecosystem approach was probably not invented when many of the areas in the sea were claimed a long time ago. Last but not least, it will be useful to learn how the different sectors are working when it comes to how their objectives will interact with the Marine Spatial Plan. Most probably, you as the planner will be the one who will have to bring order between the different objectives. The organizing of the objectives needs to be done in a systematic, hierarchical way. You can use an established method as the SMART method. The difficulties are many when trying to establishing the big picture, but the overview will be an important tool to get an idea of how the different objectives will work together at different geographical levels, the national or the Baltic Sea level. Sooner or later you will end up with a process and have to start writing the plan. Imagine that you had a smooth process with the stakeholders. The objectives are distinct from an ecological, economic and social perspective. There is a vision of how to merge the international and sector perspectives at all relevant geographical levels. It's time to make a draft plan with an ecosystem approach. You will certainly find that the different stakeholders have different opinions considering how to use the sea. If you have a good documentation of all the opinions that you have received during the process, then you have a good opportunity to motivate your decisions when presenting the draft plan. Also, The greater the changes suggested by the plan, the more important is the motivation and the coming evaluation to prove that the expected improvements are reached. In Sweden, as an example, there have been totally 4 public consultations when producing the Baltic Sea Marine Spatial Plan before it was sent to the government for decision. The picture to the right shows a suggestion from the Swedish Marine Spatial Plan proposal. As you can see, the suggestion includes moving shipping lanes, marked in orange, in a large marine Nature 2000 reserve, which is the yellow one. The Nature 2000 area was originally suggested by the county administrative boards of Kalmar and Gotland and are decided by the Swedish government back in 2016. This area protects harbour purposes and long-tailed duck. The work is in an early stage and will, if ever possible, take many years to finish. Here is a picture of the harbour purposes, and here is a picture of the long-tailed duck, for those who are not familiar with those species. Finally, when you have made the draft plan and it has been confirmed in the participation process, you will have to present it to those who are going to make the decision, most likely the government. I might disappoint many of you, but many planners believe that the plan is nothing, but the planning is everything. I believe you have understood the message that the process is really important and that the plan will be the confirmation of that process, if it was a good process. As you can see, Denmark, Sweden, Germany and Poland have marine spatial plans that look quite different. Time to reflect. Objectives and how to evaluate them. These processes are intimately linked, and perhaps it might be exactly the same process, but different stages. Don't forget to involve the stakeholders that have been invited process, and really give them an opportunity to influence the MSP work, the MSP process. In an ideal world, the plan will confirm what have been solved during the objectives and the evaluation processes, and the outcome of the plan will have to generate the predicted results. Don't forget to communicate the results of the plan and the process to those who are involved, including all the decision makers.
We have heard from Mr. Robert Dobak about how to organize the different objectives, planning objectives, how to shape them, not only to make them wisely fulfilled national goals, but also to make them smart. Smart meaning the specific, measurable, achievable, relevant and time-bound. This is very important to be able then to monitor them, to monitor the consequences of those objectives. I would like to show you some, maybe not examples, but attempts to monitoring system for Polish maritime spatial planning. When we look at the formal requirements in Poland, there is no direct obligation to monitor the maritime spatial plan, which is now binding since 1 month. However, our legal act have some stipulations towards monitoring. So we need to evaluate the plan at least every 10 years, and the environmental monitoring is to be developed within the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. Also, the evaluation is stipulated in the Bill on Polish maritime areas and maritime administration. So in order to assess the validity of the plans, the directors of the maritime offices who are responsible for maritime spatial planning and management of maritime areas shall apply to the bodies that had the legal obligations, like to all the stakeholders or the institutions that are accepting or approving the plan, obligation to participate in elaboration of the plan, also in the monitoring. This evaluation of the plan every 10 years should be based on wide stakeholder involvement, on some meetings, conferences, looking what has changed in the marine areas. On the basis of this dialogue and those expert arrangements, the directors of the maritime offices should prepare a report on the maritime spatial development. And from this report, we will see, or they will see, whether there is a need to update the plan, whether there are new conditions like new proposals, whether there are new wishes towards the Polish maritime space, whether we have new proposals, maybe there are new sectors emerged, maybe the aquaculture sector will wake up and say, hello, we want to have some space. So this is the goal of the report. Of course, based on this report, the minister competent of maritime economy will decide whether the updation of the plan is necessary. As you see from those points, this is not a typical evaluation and monitoring of the plan itself. It's rather a kind of report how the use of the marine space is changing. It's something natural. You don't need to have maritime special plan to have the changes in usage of the maritime space. So the monitoring and evaluation of the performance of the maritime special plan, it is something different and it's not required by Polish law. But still, we wanted to focus on this a little bit, and we have been participating. I'm personally, as a Maritime Institute, in a Pan-Baltic Scope project where we work together with Latvia on monitoring and evaluation of maritime special plans. As you can see here, you can look at the website and have this report with you and have a look at the report. So I would like to show you some basic information out of this report here. What is the challenge of knowing the effects of MSP? There are three main challenges. So the maritime special plans operates in a societal and natural environment that is affected by really various anthropogenic and natural processes. It's difficult to isolate the effect of maritime special plan from other factors. We have climate changes, we have different conditions changing all of the time. How we can assess whether the change is due to the maritime special plan, not due to other changes. So this is one of the challenges. The very similar challenge, marine areas are often governed already by sectoral policies before the maritime special plan starts. So we have already some policies like the energy policy or transport policy or seaport development policy, and they are already shaping the space. So how to separate them from the maritime special plan? Is it possible to separate them? Maybe not. Maybe we should not separate them, but maybe we should combine them. And the last challenge, of course, there is much more, but those are like three most important. Maritime special plan is not very, very detailed plan. Okay, in the case of Poland, it is more detailed than in other Baltic countries, but it's still not very detailed like on the land. And it shouldn't be, because it has to be some kind of flexible. So maritime special plan designate areas for specific uses, and whether the function will be performed there, it does not depend only on maritime special planning, but it depends on the economic situation in the country, like the development of the offshore wind energy. Okay, we designated the areas the most suitable from the space point of view for the energy development, but it's not the goal of the maritime special plan to make them really build there. That depends on many other factors. So you can see it's really kind of difficult to assess, to monitor whether the plan was effective or no. Another opinion from this report is that the realistic evaluation should be very pragmatic, empirical approach. And like the four questions are the most important. What works or what does not work? For whom it works, okay, and to what extent, in which circumstances, and how and why does it work? So we should also think about those aspects when working out the Maritime Special Plan. Here is an example from the European Union Maritime Special Planning Platform technical study, and it's also somehow reflected in this Pan-Baltic Scope work. You can see here the division, like the breaking down of the huge goals. It's like Robert Dobak also said, the goals are huge, and this is your job of a planner to break them down to the planning level. So here you can see a kind of attempt to break down the huge goals towards the Maritime Special Plan indicators. So we are going from the overarching, like blue growth objectives, going down to the MSP project objectives, which are more detailed. How we can transfer them into really more practical examples. So here is the example, for example, of the objective production of renewable energy at the sea. So the objective is that there will be a production, or that the production will be increased by gigawatts by, for example, 2030. So you can see here the different kinds of objectives broken down to very specific, and the examples of the evaluation questions, or even some examples of indicators. So let's look through the table. So the objective is the production of renewable energy, and the planning decision, of course, the long-term outcome is that the renewable energy is being produced offshore. Okay, that's wonderful. But this is the level of the objectives that we are not sure whether whether Maritime Special Plan is giving here any added value, because it's depending on other sectoral policies or economic situation, as I told you. But then if we go down, we can see whether the permits are submitted to the authorities. So we can see whether the designation in Maritime Special Plan of some specific areas make them more active, whether they are applying for those areas which are designated in their plans. Are those stakeholders somehow mobilized to support? Is there no problem with receiving the local decisions for localization of the offshore wind energy? And if we look at the planning decision, which are really in a Maritime Special Plan, then we have the areas designation for offshore wind energy. We have the cable routings. Those are very basic planning solutions. So areas designated, the cable routings, and some limitations given in plan or requirements concerning the designated areas. We have it, most of the plans. For example, in Poland, we have such limitations that the constructions cannot be built closer than 2 nautical miles from the shipping routes, for example, such a limitation. And then there are some examples to evaluate those planning solutions. So is the area sufficient to reach the target? We have the national targets, yes, and we have the areas designated. So then we can see after a few years whether this area is sufficient, whether we are meeting the targets, or maybe it's too small area, maybe it's too vast area. Are the areas for cable routing feasible, or it's turned out that they, like for example, the geological conditions are wrong and we have to route the cables in some other way? So those are the information that are needed for monitoring. Here you have also the more division of the indicators. So we were thinking in Baltic Scope about the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 types of indicators, depending on the moment when we use them, depending on the moment when they are needed. So like context indicators, they are the indicators which we need to collect information on general developments in the maritime sector. So those are like indicators we are using on the very first step of the planning process to know what's going on in the space. Then we have input indicators. This is like a similar to the context indicators, the collection of information, yes, so it will help us assess the preconditions. Then we have process indicators, very, very important, because we have to remember that the Maritime Directive require us to build our maritime special plans together with stakeholders. We should have a wide stakeholder process, and the process indicators are very important because they monitor whether the stakeholders have been involved in the process in a proper way. Output indicators, very important and very, very difficult. So the information on the planning decisions of the issued, like on the basis of the plan, yes. So this is for the future work, yes. Our plans are now adopted, and now we have to monitor whether the decisions are really feasible. Here you have a graph showing those like distribution of those indicators. So you can see the typical planning cycle, maritime special planning cycle. You can see from the graph that the indicators should be everywhere. And to tell you the truth, now after the few years of elaborating the Maritime Special Plan, I have to admit that we should think about the monitoring system already at the level of developing the goals and objectives of the plan, because then we should shape our objectives more in a smart way. They are easy to monitor. So you can see here also where and which step we should use what kind of indicators. So those indicators should be with us all the time. We should monitor the process at each step. What we have done in the Pan-Baltic Scope with regards to the Poland, so we have 6 main objectives of the Maritime Special Plan, and you can see that they are really wide. And of course, we can now think about them, whether they are smart in a sense of delivering a monitoring system later. And they are very difficult to monitor. So like support of sustainable development in the maritime sector with the economic, social and environmental aspects taken into account, very difficult to monitor. Yes, very difficult to prove that this goal was reached thanks to the Maritime Special Plan. National security and defense of the state is secured. This is the objective. Ensuring coordinations of subjects acting in a sea area. So like diminishing the conflict and so on and so on. So we have those 6 broad objectives, and what we have done, we have broke them down to unofficial sub-objectives. The results of our Pan-Baltic Scope exercise, those sub-objectives are not within the plan, but we just were thinking later how to divide them to more concrete, more spatially dependent measures. So like the first goal, the support of sustainable development, we tried to break them down into the sub-objectives like reducing the conflict. So to support the sustainable development, you should reduce the conflicts. Yes, so the reduction of conflicts suits the sustainable development. So create conditions for synergies and multi-use. We were also thinking about such a sub-objectives which are really dependent on maritime special planning. So this is the result. Ensure conditions for coast stability, suppose the most vulnerable and culturally valuable sectors. So like bringing those weak sectors more, giving them more power in a plan. Looking at another big objectives like national security and defense of the state is secured. So we can break them down into the sub-objectives like minimize the risk of serious accidents in the sea. So like here is the kind of applying the safety buffers between the huge constructions areas like offshore wind farms and the transport routes, for example, yes, or placing those huge multiply constructions in a space which is not so often used by shipping or by fisheries, so we can minimize the risks. There's another one, ensure coordination, so you can see here also some kind of examples of breaking down them into the sub-objectives. And then we try to fill in for each of the sub-objectives such a table where we divided the sub-objectives more down to the intermediate steps, related indicators and source of information and the final outcomes and so on. And we also try to see to which functions in a plan those indicators relate and what are the specific basic restrictions. So let's see an example of the one big objective, support of sustainable development. We see here the sub-objective, reduce conflicts, and what we have here. So we have like an intermediate step is to identify conflicts. We have to first identify the conflicts to reduce them. To identify the conflicts, how can we measure them, whether we identified any conflict or no? So we have proposed such indicators like number of complaints presented to the authorities. This, of course, required from the Maritime Administration to have a kind of records of all the complaints, of all the proposals submitted to the plan or to the process. But this is feasible. They are doing this. They just have to shape them in a way they will be feasible. A number of negative decisions like refusals. This is also kind of identification of a conflict, of a special conflict. So if we have the Maritime Special Plan with the designation areas and we have constantly some kind of investment proposals for another areas, this is conflicting and they are refused. This is creating conflicts, and then we have to think, why is it? Maybe the designations in the plan are not the perfect because the investors are looking for different areas. So this kind of idea how to find those indicators. We identify the conflicts and the conflicts are mitigated, so they are minimized, they are somehow handled. So what are the indicators? They're quite more difficult, like finalized conflict mitigation processes. So this is like when we have official complaint, they can have a court process and then they go to the court or just some kind of discussions between the investors and Maritime Administration. You can see here the sources of information, court cases or meeting memos. So those are like one of the examples. Satisfaction from the plan, also such an indicator, which is very difficult because how can you measure the satisfaction from the plan? So you can only talk to people. One of the conclusions from those monitoring exercise was that also, of course, we need indicators based on numbers, based on statistics, based on some relevant information, data, but everything has to be still assessed by the experts. So we need the indicators and we also need the experts who will analyze them and take into consideration those not measurable indicators, like, for example, satisfaction from the plan, so measured by discussion with the stakeholders, for example. The last slides showing the idea how it could be done in Poland. As I said at the beginning, there's no concrete monitoring and evaluation mechanism discussed yet in Poland, but I think the preparation of the plan showed the validity and importance of the stakeholders dialogue, and we have to keep it. The trust which was built during those 4 years, the dialogue with the stakeholders should be kept, should be heated up, and should be used for the monitoring, discussion about the satisfaction of the plan. How can we do this? Here you have the examples of like a kind of cornerstone for the Polish monitoring and evaluation system. Like we could have periodical biannual meetings with general publics, yes, on the outcomes. So we can meet like a year after adoption of the plan and ask, hello, yes, this is the plan. How do you like it? I mean, do you feel it's feasible? Do you use it? Yes. How is it? So we can talk with general public and with administration, of course. We can have such a discussion at the level of the intergovernmental committee, gathering the minister responsible for maritime space. So not only with the stakeholders, but we should have such a discussion within the government, between the different ministries, between the ministries that are steering somehow the sector developments in a sea space. Do we meet the national targets or not? Of course, the scientific conferences, this is really wonderful topic for the research. I have to tell you from my experience, the planning process, the 4 year or 5 years planning process has developed a lot of new knowledge and how to monitoring the plan. I think it's a wonderful idea for the next research. So the scientific conferences which should be supporting the maritime administration, they should be monitored by the administration. The last point is also something very important because the Polish plan, for example, is divided into 2 plans led by 2 separate maritime offices. So the proposal was still, even if they are handled by 2 different maritime offices, they should be monitored all together. What else could help the monitoring and evaluation of the Polish plan? Of course, the discussion at the Pan-Baltic level. Here you have the examples of the Pan-Baltic scope, but this is like the finished project, but there are other projects, yes, where we are discussing this. So involvement of the maritime administration and academia should be there in projects to discuss these ideas. The Maritime Special Planning EU platform reports, so we should use them, yes. We should be aware of the existing literature. What's very important, I said about this earlier, this trust between the maritime administration and the stakeholders, which was built during the maritime special process. Also, the consensus and qualitative and quantitative approaches must work together. The experts and the quantitative indicators, they have to be together. They have to go one hand all together. So I think it's all from my presentation. So you can see that the monitoring is quite challenging, but we all like challenges. So I hope Poland will succeed with the monitoring and evaluation on its plan. Thank you very much.